Welcome back, everybody. I'm Ryan Thomas. Welcome back to my podcast, my sports podcast, The Thomas Take. And this is the latest edition. UFC 210 will be live April 8th, Saturday, April 8th, in Buffalo, New York, at the KeyBank Center, KeyBank Arena, whatever you want to call it, KeyBank Center. KeyBank Arena. They've changed the name of it so many times I've lost count, and I'm mixing the names. I wouldn't be surprised next time if I called it First Key or HSBC Key or whatever. They've changed it so many times. So KeyBank Center, Buffalo, New York, downtown Buffalo, my hometown, born and raised in the Western New York area, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Moving on, this is the first UFC event in Buffalo in 22 years, dating back to UFC 7, when the sport didn't have the regulated rules in which it has now. You had guys like Ken Shamrock in the mix fighting Oleg Konargov, or whatever the hell his last name was. I won't try to butcher it. That was then. That was when the sport was at a particular time where it was not to be taken seriously. Now the sport is a worldwide phenomenon. It is unlike anything I have ever witnessed in my life, and I'm actually really privileged to have been able to witness history being made right before my very eyes. A sport in its infancy turn into a mainstream, star-driven, worldwide star-driven sport. That is remarkable. And to see that the last 15 years or so, since Zuffa purchased the company, it's remarkable, and I'm really excited to see which direction it goes in, to see the peaks and valleys, and to, analyze what they do, what they should do, what they shouldn't do. That's what I love doing with the UFC, especially. So, UFC 210, Daniel Cormier will be defending his UFC light heavyweight title against Anthony "Rumble" Johnson for the second time. This is a rematch that was supposed to happen on several other occasions. UFC 204, I believe. Maybe UFC 206, maybe. Where it was supposed to be in Toronto. Maybe it was UFC 208. I can't even remember. I lose count. But UFC 208, I believe it was, where the event was in Toronto. And they were expected to have DC and Rumble Johnson as the main event, and DC had to have surgery. So they postponed the fight, put the fight here in Buffalo, being that it's a short commute for the Canadian fans to come to this fight rather than be in Toronto. And they put Max Holloway and Anthony Pettis as the main event on that card. And it ended up being a great card, but it would have been better had DC been fighting Rumble. But I'm not going to complain, because I'm happy that Buffalo has this as their first main event in the Zuffa era UFC. DC versus Rumble Johnson. It should be a great fight. There's a lot of pitter-patter, though, going back and forth now between DC and Rumble. And I didn't expect this. I don't really think anybody did, because DC is a professional. Rumble's a soft-spoken guy. Even though he's a killer in the cage, he's kind of quiet, kind of keeps to himself. But really where this stemmed from is the poster of UFC 210, in which Anthony Johnson is 4 times the size as Daniel Cormier. And DC has a major problem with that. And I don't blame him. We'll start off with that. I do not blame Daniel Cormier one bit for being pissed off about the poster. First off, for whatever reason, and I know the particular reasons, but for whatever reason, Daniel Cormier has been one of the most disrespected UFC champions probably of all time. If anybody has anything to say about being disrespected, rather than Tyron Woodley, it is Daniel Cormier, a guy that has stepped in for one of the biggest dirtbag champions that the sport has ever had in John Jones. And I hate to use that word, dirtbag. I don't know John Jones personally, but what he did was unfathomable as not just a UFC champion, but as a human being. And DC stepped in on late notice to take on Anthony Johnson on short notice, where Johnson had a full camp, DC did not. DC was coming off a loss to John Jones, And DC beat down Anthony Rumble Johnson, made Anthony Rumble Johnson quit in the octagon, forcing him to tap. So why would Anthony Johnson be promoted as this indestructible figure versus the guy that already has beaten him? That makes virtually no sense to me. And it's not the first time the UFC has done this with a poster. I remember dating back to GSP and Diaz. They made Nick Diaz really, really big, and they made GSP very, very tiny. And it was so unfathomably just stupid that I wondered to myself, do they realize what they're doing? Like, how ridiculous this looks? The UFC poster for UFC 209 was one of the worst posters I've ever seen of Tyron Woodley with a fake UFC belt, with a photoshopped UFC belt on his waist. It just did not look good at all. The colors were all dark. It didn't look good. I don't know who is in charge of the UFC's poster department, but that needs to be reevaluated for sure. Now you have Daniel Cormier frustrated because of the fact that he submitted Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson had to work his way back up to fight Daniel Cormier, and Daniel Cormier has defended his belt in the meantime. So it's very frustrating to me why that would be the case. And DC stepped in, saved a card, took on Anthony Johnson, won the title. Regardless of whether you feel that he's not the champ or not, he is the champ, because the former champion in John Jones, the guy that never actually lost his belt, the guy that actually had to have the UFC force him to relinquish the belt, that was done due to the fact that John Jones was not representing the sport in a champion-like way, and he wasn't representing the sport of mixed martial arts as a mixed martial artist. He was really diminishing and degrading the sport by his actions outside the octagon. People, casual fans, wondering, are these guys all like this? No, just John Jones. He makes very bad decisions time and time again that has put him in the position that he is in now. Regardless of whether the substance for UFC 200, which put DC versus John Jones on the line in the main event of that fight, whether that fight didn't happen because of the fact John Jones took a tainted supplement. The supplement was heavily tainted. That is not our problem. Why was John Jones even taking anything in the first place? That is the problem. So the fact is, he got a suspension. He'll be back in July. But meanwhile, while John Jones has continued to make screw-ups throughout his career, DC has represented the sport in an honorable way. He might not be the most entertaining fighter. He's not a knockout artist. He's a take you down and pound you into the ground until you quit type fighter. Some people don't like that, but guess what? This isn't boxing. It's mixed martial arts. This sport has wrestling, jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, karate, but everything. And DC has the ability to mix in everything. He's a great mixed martial artist. One of the highly touted prospects from Strikeforce to come over to the UFC. I knew about Daniel Cormier before anybody even knew who he was in the UFC, just based on my time watching Strikeforce, as do the listeners of this show that are the diehard MMA fans. If you watched Strikeforce, you knew who Daniel Cormier was. He was an Olympic wrestler, a hotshot prospect, experiment coming into the sport of mixed martial arts. Sort of I don't want to compare him to Kimbo Slice, but he was that phenomenon. He was of the, could he transition to from Olympic wrestling to MMA? Much like the question was, could Kimbo transition to backyard fighting? Obviously, Olympic wrestling is completely different from that, but you get the point. He was going from one avenue to another, and not many people knew what to expect. And Daniel Cormier knocked guys out or knocked guys down, beat guys pillar to post that had been in the sport for a long time at heavyweight. Josh Barnett, Bigfoot Silva, he fought Frank Mir, defeated Dan Henderson. Daniel Cormier has had a fantastic career, only one blemish on that record, and that is to John Jones. And he has to get through Anthony Johnson a second time in order to fight John Jones again. And Daniel Cormier is not a young spring chicken. He's on the later half of his career. This fight would not be made right now at the UFC in Buffalo had not it been for John Jones. So if I'm Daniel Cormier and I see the poster where I'm made tiny compared to the guy that I'm fighting, guy that I'm rematching as the champion that I beat for the title, I'm a little confused as to why that is. If anything, they should be on the same even keel, or if anything, Daniel Cormier should be bigger than Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson has had to work his way back up time and time again. Missed weight several times that forced him to go from welterweight, which is 170 pounds, all the way up to heavyweight, which is 225 pounds. So in terms of respectability, I think it would go to Daniel Cormier. I do respect the fact that Anthony Johnson worked his way up to where he is now in a weight class that was 2 weight classes above where he had first started fighting in the UFC. But to put that guy in a big space on the poster versus the guy that stepped in on the late notice that had already beat him does not make much sense to me. And we also have Chris Weidman on the card versus Gegard Mousasi. That's an interesting fight as well. 2 former champions that they're not even on the poster. So I don't understand. Why wouldn't Weidman and Mousasi be on the poster as well? That's a matchup with 2 former mixed martial arts champions, Weidman of the UFC and Mousasi of Strikeforce. So you had 2 former Strikeforce champions on the card, and Cormier, who is the current light heavyweight champion for the UFC, and Mousasi, who is a former middleweight champ. If anybody should be pissed, it's Daniel Cormier. But if I'm Chris Weidman, who knocked out Anderson Silva, I'm also wondering, why the hell am I not on the poster? If I'm Gegard Mousasi, who was the Strikeforce middleweight champ, I'm wondering, why the hell am I not on the poster as well? So there's plenty of room for everyone to, bicker back and forth with the poster guys. But why is this happening? And I'm very, very curious to see what Daniel Cormier says if he does win versus Anthony Johnson after the fight. They made Anthony Johnson bigger with like a red bulb, on his photo shot, making it look like he's like this mean, angry guy. And it's like, Anthony Johnson's not. He showed that he couldn't be that guy against DC. He landed one punch that really was the only one that bothered Daniel Cormier the entire fight. And other than that, Daniel Cormier threw him around like a rag doll. So, will we see a different Anthony Johnson? I hope so, for his sake, based on the fact that they're promoting him very heavily for this fight, more so than they are Daniel Cormier. And this isn't the first time they promoted a challenger over a champion. Most recently, you think back to Amanda Nunes versus Ronda Rousey. Nunes wasn't even in the promotion. She wasn't even in the promotional piece. It was all Ronda Rousey. Everything was about the return of Ronda Rousey. That return lasted 48 seconds, with Amanda Nunes standing over the top of Ronda Rousey, as Ronda Rousey actually was out on her feet, walked away, and fell to her knees. So it makes the UFC look very bad when they promote the challenger instead of the champion. I don't understand that formula whatsoever, and Dana White's response to that with the Nunes-Rousey fight was, once Nunes beats Ronda, everyone will know who she is. That's not fair. She beat Miesha Tate. Miesha Tate beat Holly Holm. Holly Holm beat Ronda Rousey. Promote Amanda Nunes. And they did not. Daniel Cormier fought John Jones to a tough decision loss. Takes the fight on short notice against Rumble and has done nothing but represent the company in a positive way, as opposed to the former champion John Jones. I feel bad for DC. I really do. I feel like he deserves a little bit more credit for what he has done in his career. Only one career MMA loss, and he was coming from another sport, another avenue in the sport, where most people didn't think he'd be successful. And here he is, the UFC light heavyweight champion, taking on Anthony Johnson once again in a fight that I think he should win. But Rumble is a beast of an animal. He's a big fighter. He's a power puncher, and anything can happen. One punch can change the trajectory of a fight. I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take Part 2. Take care.